Hey guys, this is ktwinTV podcast and welcome to the community. With the recent uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement, Kudza and I took a week off to grieve, recharge, and learn, but now we're back.
So there is definitely a movement going on. The Black Lives Matter movement is awake, it's alive, and it's happening all over the world. Last episode, it was actually crazy to see the footage of protests everywhere, right here in the US, as well as in New Zealand, the UK, Syria, Australia, and even the Netherlands, all centered around racial inequality. And I think for that reason, it's necessary for us to have a conversation on K-Twin about racism in the United States in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, I think it's a really important conversation, especially considering that our mission is to include all people. At the same time, when it comes to these conversations, we have to set some ground rules. So firstly, we do not speak for every single Black life. We are only two people out of the entire community. Secondly, these are our beliefs based on things that we have personally experienced and what we have studied ourselves about Black history and the civil rights movement. And lastly, Black Lives Matter. So since the movement has started, I've had a lot of questions about what the movement is. And as a Black person who has Black family, I was really familiar with the phrase and the movement. But I did some more specific research and I found that it's an international human rights movement and social media hashtag created by three Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. Black Lives Matter was established in 2013 when an unarmed Black 17-year-old named Trayvon Martin was murdered. So the night of Trayvon's murder, he was actually on his way home from purchasing Skittles from a local convenience store. Trayvon's innocent life was taken by a neighborhood vigilante, George Zimmerman, that night. He suspected Trayvon of being a criminal. George Zimmerman in that moment had phoned the police and they told him to stop chasing Trayvon, but he disregarded these instructions and pursued the unnecessary chase. Trayvon was shot 100 yards from his home, and his murderer, George Zimmerman, got off scot-free, claiming self-defense.
Yeah, and what's scary is that the case of Trayvon Martin is not an isolated incident, and Trayvon Martin happened back in 2012, and yeah. I feel like I'll always remember his passing. Anyway, there are countless current events as well as historical events which expose the idea that Black lives are deemed insignificant here in the United States.
No criminal charges for the deadly police shooting of an unarmed man.
No federal charges in the deadly police shooting.
Prosecutors say they will not charge 4 Wilmington police officers.
Declined to bring charges.
No criminal charges.
Dropped all charges.
No charges.
No charges.
Would not file criminal charges in another officer-involved shooting.
And that is why the Black Lives Matter movement was created. The mission of the Black Lives Matter movement is to uplift the Black community and prevent violence toward Black communities. Black Lives Matter is a rally cry for all Black lives, including Black queer, Black trans, disabled, undocumented, those with records, women, all Black lives along the gender spectrum. Many people have now taken the statement Black Lives Matter and recognize it as the phrase which embodies the support for all Black lives, and I think we can notice that even in protests when people say Black Lives Matter, and that's the rally cry for everybody.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like Kudzai said, Black Lives Matter is a rally cry for Black lives, and it's actually been revived by the murder of George Floyd. I've had a few people ask me who George Floyd is, and they were just kind of confused on the story. So for people who may not know who that is, earlier this year in May, police were called when he was accused of buying cigarettes with a fake $20 bill. Soon after, the police arrived at the scene and they escalated the situation by pinning Floyd to the ground. One of the officers held Floyd's neck down with his knee, which suffocated him, and there were numerous spectators around, as well as George himself, pleading for his life as he was being suffocated. And 8 minutes and 46 seconds later, he died from suffocation. Even after he died, the officer did not remove his knee from his neck, and for a full minute, actually. And even after paramedics arrived at the scene, George Floyd's passing has been the catalyst for so many protests globally as well as nationally. So because of these protests happening, there has also been a lot of concerns about why they're happening, if they're important. And I did some of my own research on that as well. And protests actually get people politically activated, and they bring awareness to issues such as police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement in general. Protests usually have lasting effects on voting, political contributions, societal ideologies, as well as future participation in politics and voting. They send signals to policymakers, and they might not always be immediate changes, but it forces politicians to do the right thing and think about what the people want. Protests essentially cause action. More specifically, things that protests have done are bring independence to numerous countries. They provided rights for Black people within the civil rights movement, as well as now, and the LGBTQ community. Like I said, the change isn't always immediate, but it's always great to start somewhere for any kind of change, and protests inspire people. If protests did nothing, no one would do them. Let's even look at the Freedom Riders movement, or the Birmingham movement, or the Montgomery bus boycott, or even MLK's famous protests. We have to use our voices if we want to see change. And I think it's also important to recognize that protests are a common outcome for racism and oppression, but there are also so many psychological and emotional outcomes as well. This is something that a lot of people fail to recognize, but we really want to get into that today.
I totally agree. There are a lot of emotional and psychological effects and outcomes that come from racism and oppression. For example, when I look closely at George Floyd's case, the part that breaks my heart is the trauma that comes from his death. Let's consider first Darnella Frazier, a 17-year-old young Black teenage girl who is the one who recorded the entire encounter. She watched the murder of George Floyd and will likely always remember that. I feel for her and I applaud her bravery. Her 10 minutes of bravery have marked a turning point in history as people all across the globe are finally acknowledging the need for change in this system. However, there's obviously trauma that comes from watching a murder take place, especially since she's Black and the murder was race-related. People need to remember that racial incidences have a lasting effect emotionally and mentally. Black people are humans too. Black people have emotions too. Black people have trauma too. Black Lives Matter is not a trend. People are deeply affected by these outcomes. Now let's consider George Floyd's daughter, Gianna Floyd. I recently watched an interview with 6-year-old Gianna and it broke my heart. She knows her father isn't home, but she doesn't truly comprehend the depth of the situation of all that happened to George Floyd. When she's older, I can't even imagine the traumatic and emotional impact that will come as a result of these videos. I think the same about Philando Castile's daughter. She was 4 years old. She was in the backseat of the car when her father was gunned down to death in the passenger seat by a police officer. She witnessed the murder of her father at 4 years old. Too young to understand the depth of the situation, she even comforted her mother as the two were put into the back of a police vehicle.
Mom, please stop cussing and screaming because I don't want you to get shielded.
Okay, give me a kiss.
I can keep you safe.
It's okay, I got it, okay? I can't believe they just did that.
I wish this town was safer. I don't want it to be like this anymore.
The pair pray, unaware Castile has died.
Please, Lord, tell us, give us a sign that feel us okay. Please, Lord, I just need a sign.
And tell God that we need a ride home too.
Who will they now call in times of trouble? Who will they call for in a moment of emergency? What about Tamir Rice's family? What about Philando Castile's family, Eric Garner's family? Who will they call when the police are the ones who murdered their loved ones? Because of the way that police have dehumanized and murdered Black people all across the nation, calling the police becomes a triggering and traumatic experience. Even the sounds of sirens evoke shudders and panic in many Black folk. Each Black murder is not an isolated and unique situation. There's an undeniable pattern in the United States. Black men are specifically 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. Black people made up 23% of the deaths done by police, yet we only make up 13% of the population. We are such a small population, but we make up almost a quarter of the deaths done by police in 2019. This is a police and Black issue. Black families across the United States consider it a moment of life or death when we meet police. Today, it could be Breonna Taylor, but tomorrow it could be me or a loved one.
Yes, I think it's very important for everyone to acknowledge the fact that race-related incidents are traumatic for all Black people. Not just Black people in Minneapolis or New York or Texas or Georgia. When we hear about another one of these cases, Black people are grieving too, and we connect with the families of those who have passed. These people look like us, and essentially they are us. It's also important for non-Black people to understand that race-related incidents aren't always easy for us to discuss with them. Although their intentions may be good, I think Kudzai and I can both agree that it is hard to open up because we know that non-Black people won't always understand the situations or relate to them in the way that we would. Additionally, to discuss racial issues in a critical and analytical way is emotionally taxing. These conversations force Black people to relive traumatic racial experiences as we break down these issues. And it forces us to somehow swallow the emotional side of things and then quickly become the hero by educating non-Black people using our own trauma. This reminds me of something that Kudzai was actually saying earlier this episode. Black people are humans too. Black people have emotions too. And Black people have trauma too. This is something that we, as well as many of our other Black peers, have dealt with a lot due to the uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement. And since the loud global response to George Floyd, many of our Black friends and peers have voiced the sudden massive outreach from non-Black peers. These messages vary from who is George Floyd? What can I do to support Black Lives Matter? Why are people looting? All of these questions are awesome, and we're glad that you guys are engaging yourselves in these conversations. But I think it's also important to remember that you also have a device at your fingertips that you can use to answer these questions.
Mm-hmm.
Google is free,
Mm-hmm.
and resources and education are literally in the palm of your hand. So I think don't go treat your one Black friend as a Black encyclopedia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think instead what non-Black activists can do is check in with Black friends, but not to educate you, but to check on their well-being. Ask them if they're okay, what you can do for them. Educate yourself as much as you can. Like Kundai was saying, all of us has a phone in the palm of our hands that has Google, and we can do some of our own research. And if you run into confusing areas or things you don't understand, there are numerous resources out there and people who are there to help you. There's a local NAACP, there are professors, there are peers. Don't be afraid to make mistakes when you learn. Push yourself to be uncomfortable, talk about race, contribute to the movement, whether it's art, donation, or using your social media platform. You can petition, protest, march, but you need to be vocal in some fashion. And then use your privilege and platform to fight for others. But most importantly, do not expect your Black friends to educate you. It is not their responsibility. It is not our responsibility to do such emotionally taxing work while you kick back and relax with Google at your fingertips.
Yes, I really agree with that. I think that's been a problem for a lot of people in the Black community as these issues have come up. And at the same time, I think we can all agree that there is hope in the way that people are finally acknowledging these issues, and people are making conscious efforts to make a change. We've been fighting this fight for all of our lives, all of the Black people's lives before us and even after us, and it won't end tomorrow, but it's encouraging to see the results that have come from fighting and protests. For example, many American cities are now defunding the police and diverting those funds to youth and social services. Police and citizens are being held accountable for race-related violence. There have been reforms in physical contact, such as the Eric Garner Anti-Chokehold Act. And lastly, there are statues, flags, and buildings with historically racist backgrounds which are being removed or renamed.
Above all, most of us can agree that we are happy to see the reforms that have been made, but we still have a long way to go. We have to use our victories as encouragement to keep going, and we can't rest until the work is done. The last thing I'll say is that this movement should be personal to you, even if you aren't Black, because you are human. Anyway, thank you all for watching this episode. I know we covered a lot of ground today, so if you have any questions about our content, feel free to ask. Our DMs are always open. As a community, we really value education and inclusivity, and so we hope that you guys could learn at least a few things from us today.
Our DMs are always open. Feel free to ask any questions, and we hope to see you guys next Sunday on ktwinTV.